Kenan opened up and found Mrs. Rostovsky standing there looking much the same as she did today. She thrust a potted fern into his hand, stepped forward, removed her shoes, and looked at him. "I'm your neighbor, Mrs. Rostovsky," she said. "Do you have any slippers?" Kenan introduced himself, handed the plat to his bemused wife, and rooted through several boxes until he found a pair of slippers. "They're a little small," she said as she jammed her feet into them, "but they'll do for now. Next time I'll bring my own." They sat on the sofa Kenan's parents had given them as a wedding present, while his wife made them coffee. Mrs. Rostovsky gave him a long list of do's and don'ts regarding the fern, which he listened to as attentively as he could. The baby was sleeping in the next room. He mentioned her presence several times and spoke in a soft voice, hoping Mrs. Rostovsky would follow suit. But she grew louder every time she spoke, until it seemed to Kenan that she was shouting. His wife returned to the coffee with the coffee just as the baby woke screaming. She scowled at him as though it was his fault Mrs. Rostovsky couldn't keep her voice down. When Amila was gone, Mrs. Rostovsky took a small sip of her coffee and wrinkled her face. "That's quite a holler your baby has. I hope you and your wife aren't as loud." Kenan assured her that they were not, and the rest of the visit passed more or less without incident. She returned once a week from then on, usually in the evenings when Kenan was home. He followed her instructions about the fern as well as he could, but it deteriorated rapidly in his care. This did not escape Mrs. Rostovsky's notice. On a subsequent visit, she looked at the dead fern, shook her head, and said, "I hope you're better with children than you are with plants. They are considerably more difficult." Kenan later learned that every time someone moved into the building, Mrs. Rostovsky brought them a fern that, without exception, died a few weeks later. The common opinion was that it had somehow been poisoned, doomed from the beginning, but Kenan never really believed it. He had, however, noticed that her apartment itself had no plants of any kind. He often found himself defending her to others, half-heartedly, reminding them that her husband had died 50 years ago and she had been alone ever since. But the more he thought about it, the less it seemed of a good reason for her bitterness. She couldn't have been more than 25 when she was widowed, which was certainly young enough to begin a life again. He didn't have a clue what had made her the way she was. If it was losing her husband in the war itself, or something that happened after. Maybe she was always like this. None of this explains why he is here with her impossible bottles today, he knows. He made her a promise, but he has broken promises to others and suspects he will again. He can't even pretend he likes her. And while he's a little afraid of her, he isn't so intimidated that he needs to bow to her every wish. If he's honest with himself, he has no idea why he keeps bringing Mrs. Rostovsky water. It's time to get moving. The brewery isn't much farther, just a bit west and then south up the hill. He crosses the street and cuts through an empty lot, taking cover where he can find it. As he climbs the hill, water runs down the street through the taps of the brewery. The trail of those who come before reminds Kenan of the traces slugs leave in a garden. A truck with an enormous plastic tank in the back passes him, honks its horn, forcing him to the side of the road. There are a lot more people on the street now, most laden with the paraphernalia of water collection, and they too are forced to the side of the road for this truck and several others that will follow soon after. It's a pilgrimage, a parade, all of them rats of Hamelin. When the bright red hulk of the brewery comes into view, he feels both happy and apprehensive, because although he has at last arrived at his destination, he knows he has a long way to go before he is home again. So he's happy, but at the same time, he knows that it's not over. He still has to make it back alive with the water. Rats of Hamelin is an allusion to the Pied Piper and him being able to call the rats to him with music, right? A pilgrimage is a religious event where you go to pray at a certain church or sanctuary. So it's an interesting choice of wording there because that is what water has become, right? The new religion, because it is so necessary for life.